I got the blues now, baby, 'cause I haven't read in a while. You know I haven't been reading at all.
You got them blues, baby. Well, I got news that'll make you smile.
Oh, yeah?
Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Come hitch a ride on that rainbow, and it'll cure what ails you. That ain't no lie.
Oh, hold up, mama. How am I gonna hitch on this reading rainbow? Is it gonna be on a bike or a train or a scooter car?
No, 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 no. You just gotta ride that butterfly in the sky.
Oh, now we're talking. Yeah, I'm gonna wash my blues away, baby. Ride that reading rainbow till I die.
O'Brien, and O'Brien forced him to look at himself in the mirror, in a three-way mirror, to see how degraded and disgusting and emaciated he had become from being in the Ministry of Love. And O'Brien says to him, "You're a difficult case, but don't give up hope. Everything's cured sooner or later. In the end, we shall shoot you." So now we're going to start chapter 4. And we only have 3 very short chapters left, so we're kind of wrapping up at the end now. So he was much better. He was growing fatter and stronger every day, if it was proper to speak of days. The white light and the humming sound were the same as ever, but the cell was a little more comfortable than the others he had been in. There was a pillow and a mattress on the plank bed, and a stool to sit on. They had given him a bath, and they allowed him to wash himself fairly frequently in the tin basin. They even gave him warm water to wash with. They had given him new underclothes and a clean suit of overalls. They had dressed his varicose ulcer with a soothing ointment, and they had pulled out the remnants of his teeth and given him a new set of dentures. So suddenly, they've decided that they're going to start taking really good care of him and letting him clean himself and have a better bed and take care of all the things he needs to do to be, like, comfortable. Weeks or months must have passed. It would have been possible now to keep count. It would have been possible now to keep count of the passage of time if he had felt any interest in doing so, since he was being fed at what appeared to be regular intervals. He was getting, he judged, 3 meals in the 24 hours. Sometimes he wondered dimly whether he was getting them by night or by day. The food was surprisingly good, with meat at every 3rd meal. Once there was even a packet of cigarettes. He had no matches, but the never-speaking guard who brought his food would give him a light. The first time he tried to smoke it made him sick, but he persevered and spun the packet out for a long time, smoking half a cigarette after each meal. They had given him a white slate with a stump of pencil tied to the corner. At first he made no use of it. Even when he was awake, he was completely torpid. Often he would lie from one meal to the next almost without stirring, sometimes asleep, sometimes waking into vague reveries in which was too much trouble to open his eyes. He had long grown used to sleeping with a strong light on his face. It seemed to make no difference, except that one's dreams were more coherent. He dreamed a great deal all through this time, and they were always happy dreams. He was in the Golden Country, or he was sitting amongst enormous, glorious, sunlit ruins with his mother, with Julia, with O'Brien, not doing anything, merely sitting in the sun, talking of peaceful things. Such thoughts as he had had when he was awake were mostly about his dreams. He seemed to have lost the power of intellectual effort, now that the stimulus of pain had been removed. He was not bored. He had no desire for convention or distraction, merely to be alone, not to be beaten or questioned, to have enough to eat, and to be clean all over, was completely satisfying. So Winston has been completely stripped down of any of his intellectual being, meaning he's no longer thinking deep thoughts about Big Brother or society or the world or the way things are and the way things should be. He's literally just going through the motions of eating food and taking showers and laying around, and he's having these wonderful dreams that make him feel so peaceful and happy. And then he wakes up and all he wants to do is just be left alone to, like, think about those dreams he's been having and not think about anything more serious than that and just eat and take baths and stuff. So he's completely satisfied. By degrees he came to spend less time in sleep, but he still felt no impulse to get off the bed. All he cared for was to lie quiet and feel the strength gathering in his body. He would finger himself here and there, trying to make sure that it was not an illusion that his muscles were growing rounder and his skin tauter. Finally, it was established beyond a doubt that he was growing fatter. His thighs were now definitely thicker than his knees, and after that, reluctantly at first, he had begun exercising himself regularly. In a little while he could walk 3 kilometers, measured by pacing the cell, and his bowed shoulders were growing straighter. He attempted more elaborate exercises and was astonished and humiliated to find what things he could not do. He could not move out of a walk. He could not hold his stool out at arm's length. He could not stand on one leg without falling over. He squatted down on his heels and found that with an agonizing pains in thigh and calf, he could just lift himself to a standing position. He lay flat on his belly and tried to lift his weight by his hands. It was hopeless. He could not raise himself a centimeter. But after a few more days, a few more meal times, even that feat was accomplished. A time came when he could do it 6 times running. He began to grow actually proud of his body and to cherish an intermittent belief that his face was also growing back to normal. Only when he chanced to put his hand on his bald scalp did he remember the seamed, ruined face that had looked back at him out of the mirror. So not only is he physically getting stronger, but he's starting to see that he can actually do more things with his body, because for so long he's been beaten and starved and electrocuted to a point where his body could not do any of those things. And now he's finally getting the strength back to kind of be his normal self. But he obviously doesn't have a mirror, so he can't look to see what the progress looks like. So he's just imagining what his ugly face looked like when he looked in the 3-way mirror. His mind grew more active. He sat down on the plank bed, his back against the wall and the slate on his knees, and set to work deliberately at the task of re-educating himself. He had capitulated with that was agreed. In reality, as he saw now, he had been ready to capitulate long before he had taken the decision. From the moment when he was inside the Ministry of Love, and yes, even during those minutes when he and Julia had stood helpless while the iron voice from the telescreen told them what to do, he had grasped the frivolity, the shallowness of his attempt to set himself up against the power of the party. He knew now that for 7 years the thought police had watched him like a beetle under a magnifying glass. There was no physical act, no words spoken aloud, and they had not noticed, no train of thought that they had not been able to infer. Even the speck of whitish dust on the cover of his diary they had carefully replaced. They had played soundtracks to him, shown him photographs. Some of them were photographs of Julia and himself. Yes, even he could not fight against the party any longer. Besides, the party was in the right. It must be so. How could the immortal collective brain be mistaken? But what external standard could you check into judgments? Sanity was statistical. It was merely a question of learning to think as they thought, only the pencil felt thick and awkward in his fingers. He began to write down the thoughts that came into his head. So Winston is going through a very intense moment of change, and he is actually starting to believe that the party has been right all along and that he's been wrong. And while he was getting tortured and everything, they had pictures of him and Julia probably having sex, hanging out, doing all the things they'd been doing. They'd been following him around. They read his diary. They put that little piece of chalk back on the top of his diary because they wanted him to not know that they knew everything he'd been doing. So at this point, he's like, wow, they've been right all along, because how could the collective brain, how could all those people from the party be wrong? It must be just me, is what he's thinking. So he begins to write down something, and he writes down the first thoughts that came into his head, and he wrote the first in large, clumsy capitals, "Freedom is slavery." Then, almost without a pause, he wrote beneath it, 2 and 2 make 5. But then there came a sort of check. His mind, as though shying away from something, seemed unable to concentrate. He knew that he knew what came next, but for the moment he could not recall it. When he did recall it, it was only by consciously reasoning out what it must be. It did not come out of his own accord. He wrote, "God is power." Which is interesting, because the party doesn't believe in God. So who might he mean by God? God isn't the powerful one, because he doesn't believe in God, and neither does the party. But he is writing "freedom is slavery," which is a party slogan, and he is writing 2 and 2 make 5, which is what O'Brien wants him to believe. So what does God is power mean? He accepted everything. The past was alterable. The past never had been altered. Oceania was at war with Eastasia. Oceania had always been at war with Eastasia. Jones, Aronson, and Rutherford were guilty of the crimes they were charged with. He had never seen the photograph that disproved their guilt. It had never existed. He had invented it. He remembered remembering contrary things, but those were false memories, products of self-deception. How easy it all was. Only surrender, and everything else followed. It was like swimming against a current that swept you backwards, however hard you struggled, and then suddenly deciding to turn around and go with the current instead of opposing it. Nothing had changed except your own attitude. The predestined thing happened in any case. He hardly knew why he had ever rebelled. Everything was easy, except anything could be true. The so-called laws of nature were nonsense. The law of gravity was nonsense. "If I wished," O'Brien had said, "I could float off this floor like a soap bubble." Winston worked it out. If he thinks he floats off the floor, and if I simultaneously think I see him do it, then the thing happens. Suddenly, like a lump of submerged wreckage breaking the surface of water, the thought burst into his mind. It doesn't really happen. We imagine it. It's a hallucination. He pushed the thought under instantly. The fallacy was obvious. It presupposed that somewhere or other outside of oneself there was a real world where real things happened. But how could there be such a world? What knowledge have we of anything save through our own minds? All happenings are in the mind. Whatever happens in all minds truly happens. So for once now, Winston's actually starting to have those deeper thoughts he's always had, and he's questioning his own ability to convince himself that the party is right. And he's like, I know all the arguments, I know all of the contradictories to what I'm saying, but how could they all be wrong? If there's so many of them believing it's right, how could they all be wrong? Because consciousness would be our own perception of reality, right? And so Winston's kind of grappling with this idea of, is my reality and my consciousness the wrong one and everyone else is right? He had no difficulty in disposing of the fallacy, and he was in no danger of succumbing to it. He realized, nevertheless, that it ought never to be occurred to him. The mind should develop a blind spot whenever a dangerous thought presented himself. The process should be automatic, instinctive. Crime stop, they called it in Newspeak. So Winston is saying now, every time I have these thoughts, I should instantly be able to just block them out of my mind and be like, nope, not going to think about that. Nope, not going to do anything about that, because that's the safe thing to do, right? And that's what the party wants him to do. And so he's like, I'm going to start practicing that. He set to work to exercise himself in Crime Stop. He presented himself with propositions. The party says the earth is flat. The party says that ice is heavier than water, and trained himself in not seeing or not understanding the arguments that contradicted them. It was not easy. It needed great powers of reasoning and improvisation. The arithmetical math problems, raised, for instance, by such a statement as 2 and 2 make 5, were beyond his intellectual grasp. It needed also a sort of athleticism of mind, an ability at one moment to make the most delicate use of logic, and at the next to be unconscious of the crudest logical errors. Stupidity was as necessary as intelligence, and as difficult to attain. All the while, with one part of his mind, he wondered how soon they would shoot him. Everything depends on yourself, O'Brien had said, but he knew that there was no conscious act by which he could bring it nearer. It might be 10 minutes hence, or 10 years. They might keep him for years in solitary confinement. They might send him to a labor camp. They might release him for a while, as they sometimes did. It was perfectly possible that before he was shot, the whole drama of his arrest and the interrogation would be enacted all over again. The one certain thing was that death never came at the expected moment. The tradition, the unspoken tradition, somehow you knew it, though you never heard it said, was that they shot you from behind, always in the back of the head, without warning, as you walked down a corridor from cell to cell.